I think we're around text number 5. So what we got so far is we got an elaborate analogy. You guys know what analogies are? I'm going to guess you don't. Analogies are a cognitive tool where you compare one thing to something else, and the thing that you're comparing something to has to be something which is extremely familiar to you. And in an analogy, the comparison is spelled out and explained, so it becomes easy for you to discern the lesson that's being taught. And so analogies are didactic devices, at least in the field of teaching, and they're used to explain something by comparing it in a very specific way, elaborately, to something that you're familiar with. So then you have elements of analogies. Similes and metaphors are elements of an analogy. Similes are themselves a subset of metaphor, and both similes and analogies are analogical in that they're used to build analogies. Metaphors are when you make a direct comparison. You say, he's a beast. And then it's left to your imagination to figure out how somebody is a beast. Or they're an ocean. What do you mean somebody's an ocean? You don't literally mean they're an ocean. And so it's up to you to figure out what that means. Similes are when you use the word like or as, and then you explain that something is like an ocean or someone is like a beast. And then if you start to explain exactly how they're like a beast or how they're like an ocean, then that becomes an analogy. But if it's not elaborate and it hasn't become like a full teaching tool, then it remains a simile. So he's like an ocean with regards to his depth of thought. Then that makes it clear. As an ocean is deep, so his thoughts are also deep. Or she's like a beast in her ability to fight. She fights, with the tenacity of a beast. And then that gives you an indication of what's, that becomes an analogy. And then those similes and metaphors become part of an analogy. They build into an analogy when it becomes explanatory and it becomes sufficient for you to make that comparison. Do you guys follow that? So we got a rather elaborate analogy that used, it was somewhat cryptic, and it used extensive metaphor. There's a tree, right? And so there's a tree, and its roots are upwards, and its branches are downwards, so it's a reflection. Actually, its roots are also downwards. Now I'm confused. Its leaves are the Vedic hymns. They're Chanda, the Parna, the leaves are the Vedic hymns. So that, that sounds like it's a good tree, but then it's nourished by the gunas. And the branches and the trunks are bound by fruitive activities, bound by karma. Now the tree's not a good thing anymore. You can't see where the tree comes from or where it's going. Where does it begin? Where does it end? You can't figure that out. And the goal was to cut down that tree. And so now this tree becomes this massive, monstrous metaphor which you're supposed to turn into an analogy to help you better understand the world. And so, you've got the Vedas, the hymns of the Veda are the leaves, but the leaves are bad and the branches are bad because the whole thing is bound to karma and keeps you in this world. Just like oftentimes religion becomes used in lieu of spirituality. and something is religious but not spiritual, or something's ritualistic but not spiritual. Does that make sense? Okay. So you've got this example of an ashwata tree, like a banyan tree, or like a ficus religiosa. There's a bunch of trees. The ashwata tree is a little different than the banyan tree, but they're both very similar in that they're used in Vedic ceremonies. They're considered to be sacred trees. And they grow secondary trunks off of their roots to support their large canopy. And you get lost in them. In this sense, the analogy of the banyan tree brings to mind something like a spider's web, which you get lost in. And so the goal is to not get caught up in it. And so that, we just finished that. And then we're told you have to cut down that tree. Asanga shastrena chitva. You have to cut it down with the weapon of detachment. And then tat parimargatavyam. Tarimargatavyam. Tat parimargatavyam, you have to then search after padam, that place. Yasmin gata na vivartanti bhuyaha, from which having gone you don't come back, you have to go to heaven. And tam eva chadyam purusham prapadye, there I surrender to the primeval being, to the original being. Yata pravritti prashrishta purani, from which everything has expanded since time immemorial. This is the third and fourth verse. So you're cutting down the tree of the material world that normally beguiles people, that even has religious trappings, so that you can go beyond this world and search out the original supreme being from whom everything comes, including the tree and everything else. That's what we've gotten in the first 4 verses. And that's important information for making sense out of what comes next. So, text 5. Those who are free from false prestige. These are all called, these are mostly, maybe not all of them, most of them are bahuvrihi samas. Just like when you say the red coat, you could either mean literally a red coat, or you could mean British soldiers who traditionally wore red coats. Which is like you say the black shirts. You could literally mean a black shirt, or you could mean the New Zealand rugby team, which is known as the black shirts. So that same, where you'll say something which is a defining feature of something, and it stands for a person who actually participates in that, as opposed to the actual thing. That's done in Sanskrit. And so here you have those who are free from false prestige. Nirmana moha means nirmana moha jita sangha dosha, conquering over the fault of attachment, free from the illusion of possessiveness, adhyatma nitya, forever in the consciousness of the self, vinivritta kama, turning away from desires, dvandva vimukta sukha dukkha sangyate sangyai, free from the dualities known as happiness and distress, gachanti amudha padam avyayam tat, they go undelusioned, they go clear-minded towards the eternal abode. So the translation, those who are free from false prestige. So it's like they say a quality, and it's those people who have that quality, those people who are like this, those people who are like this, those people who are like this. That's what's being done. Those who are free from false prestige, illusion, and false association, who understand the eternal, who are done with material lust, and who are free from the dualities of happiness and distress, and who unbewildered know how to surrender the Supreme Person, they attain to that eternal kingdom. You see that they know how to surrender the Supreme Person? That's not in the verse. Prabhupada threw that in there for good measure. Why would Prabhupada have added something in the verse that's not there? Because he's into bhakti and he just wants to give a plug for bhakti? Why would Prabhupada have added that in there? Try not to look at me bewildered. Try to think through the question I just asked and answer it.
He's defining what these things are that Krishna is saying. He doesn't want people to misinterpret them.
Well, if you ask for a glass of lemonade and I say she wanted a burrito, and then somebody goes, why would you make that up and throw that in there? And you go, well, because he doesn't want you to misunderstand. She doesn't want you to misunderstand. Adding something in there that's not in the verse creates misunderstanding. Did you follow that? So I don't see that defends him. Unless you can demonstrate that that's really what Krishna is saying. You can't, otherwise you can say anything. And you can say, well, that's just what he really meant. But without any evidence to support that, how do I know it's not just what... Like there was a show, I think it's on Discovery Channel, it's called Disclosure. It's some doctor who says he was kidnapped by aliens. I saw the trailer for it. Didn't watch the show. Didn't intrigue me. But he says, he met an almond-eyed alien on a mountaintop in North Carolina while he was meditating on the mountain, and the alien touched him on the shoulder, and he disappeared and went in the spaceship for 3 to 4 hours, and that was the trailer. And so I just because of the way my brain works, I immediately thought, well, how would I respond to somebody telling me a story like this? And I would say, what evidence do you have that I should believe you? You're telling me a story which is outside of my general experience of the world. I don't want to dismiss it as being impossible. Certainly extraterrestrial life isn't impossible, and somebody more advanced than us could theoretically come here and take people up for joyrides on their fancy airplane. No problem. That's not by itself absolutely impossible. But I need some evidence to support the story. Otherwise it just sounds like some kind of a fairy tale. What am I hearing? You don't hear something coming from here?
I hear something. It sounds like rain almost.
Right?
So,
Yeah.
It's the fan. It's like
Okay, it's a fan. Okay, gotcha. All right, that makes sense. Okay. Now I know what that was. If something like that's the aliens talking to you, be like, well, what's the evidence of that, right? No, like that's sound. But there's a more reasonable explanation, namely the fan. So if somebody wants to give evidence for something, that's great. But you just said, well, that's what Krishna really wants, but you gave no evidence for that. Therefore, it's no different than the guy saying aliens kidnapped me without any evidence to support it. Let me say it again. Prabhupada adds in those who know how to surrender the Supreme Person. Now, I'm just helping you out here. There's nothing in this verse that says that. So why did Prabhupada throw it in here?
he wants to connect this verse to the last verse and show us that there's an equation like that is what you're seeking, and then Krishna is describing.
Yeah, because in the last verse it says, Adyam Purusham Prapadye. I surrender to the Supreme Being. That's in the last verse. I read that verse to you guys 2 minutes ago. And so Prabhupada, by taking that and putting it into this verse, is showing a connection. Namely that you go here and you pierce through the material world, and then you get to the Supreme Being and you surrender. And the people who are able to do that, who are able to cut down the tree of illusion with the weapon of detachment. It's a very elaborate metaphor. Very elaborate. And it's definitely analogical. It's not all spelled out. It might not even be an analogy because it's not all spelled out. It's just a bunch of metaphors on top of each other without really giving you too much to go on. You don't get this so much except for in poetry, where people will give you an elaborate metaphor without much explanatory value. So you have to interpret one thing after another, after another, after another. You guys follow this? And so we get this elaborate metaphor, and then the next verse it's really the limbs of what is involved in being able to cut down the tree of illusion with the weapon of detachment, which then enables you to surrender to the Supreme Being and connect with the source of everything, including that tree of illusion. Do you guys follow this? But instead of getting enmeshed in the web, you connect to the root, which connects you to the whole tree. Do you get that? Instead of getting enmeshed in the web, like a person trying to water leaves on a tree, you're able to connect with the root and thereby understand how the whole thing works. And so this verse is telling you the qualifications you need to have. And Prabhupada adds into that list of qualifications the defining feature of the preceding verse, because obviously those things are related. Do you guys follow that? You guys follow that? All right, that was good. That supreme abode of mind is not illumined by the sun or moon, nor by fire or electricity. Well, that's a problem. There's nothing in Sanskrit for electricity because electricity doesn't exist at the time the Gita was composed. I mean, there's lightning, there's tadit, there's lightning. But electricity, no dice. Those who reach it never return to this material world. Okay? Number one, how do you troubleshoot Prabhupada's bad translation work of including electricity now? And then number two, why is this verse even here? Did you guys understand my question? Okay, you first.
I don't think it's bad translation work. I think it's just making it more relevant to the modern world.
There you go. Bingo, right? So what illumined darkness in Vedic times? Fire. What illumines darkness in modern times? Electricity. And therefore Prabhupada is modernizing the translation. There's no fault whatsoever. I saw one scholar one time criticizing Prabhupada for this, and I just thought to myself, like this is really what you've got your time, this is like what you spend your time doing, this is your big moment, this is how you want to spend it. And so, yeah, obviously Prabhupada is making the translation relevant and communicating to us what Krishna would have been intending and the kind of impact that a statement like this would have had to people in the Vedic times. Great. So this abode of Krishna's is self-luminous, right? It's like this glowing, illuminated, fluorescent, neon world where everything is self-illumined and has its own light within it. Antar Jyoti, light within it. It doesn't require external lighting sources. Okay, now we troubleshot the translation work. And so then, what's the value of this verse? Why is this verse here? Yeah.
We just finished talking about attaining an eternal kingdom, so the next logical thing would be to start to talk about what that eternal kingdom is like.
Yeah, you see how logical it is? I've got this elaborate metaphor that doesn't have a lot of explanatory notes. Partially because if I try to explain to you how to extricate yourself from a spider web, that's not what you do. You avoid spider webs. If you're a human being, you don't have to avoid spider webs. Unless it's a poisonous spider. But if you are an insect, then you need to avoid spider webs because they are large enough to trap you. This is kind of a common trope you see in fantasy type movies and novels and such. I'm thinking of Lord of the Rings. They get stuck in a big, massive spider web, and it's a problem. Somehow or other they get out, but it's a massive problem. So you might think, oh, spider web, no big deal. Imagine a huge spider web of the scale that Krishna is talking about. You going to get out of that? The answer is no. And so to intricately describe how to get out of the spider web wouldn't make sense. Rather, you discuss the general principle that the spider web should be avoided, should be cut down at the root. And so there's a lack of, I don't know. There's a few reasons. Number one is when you give these elaborate metaphors without too many explanatory notes, it forces the people to think. Also, sometimes those metaphors are multivalent. They have several layers of meaning that are possible. And if you try to define them too much, you might get rid of or overly define something. And some of its didactic value of being meditational and being able to fill in the blanks yourself are lost. And then there's also that the very thing he's describing, it's not meant to be engaged with, it's meant to be cut down and surpassed. Do you guys follow this? So we start off with this huge metaphor, and then Krishna begins discussing in detail what it means to search out and surrender to the Supreme Being, and the personal qualifications you have to have. Nirmana dosha. You have to be free from, I thought it was nirmama dosha. It's nirmana dosha, my bad. And so you have to be free from prestige, the illusion of prestige. And you have to be jita sangha dosha, free from being overly attached to materialistic people. And adhyatma nitya, always focusing on the self. And vinivritta kama, your desires have to have gone away. And dvandvair vimukta sukha dukkha sangyair. You have to be free from, liberated from the dualities known as happiness and distress. Those people can tat parimargatavyam, they can search after that. Padam, that place. Gachanti, they can go padam, to that place. Padam means place. They can go to that place. So you get the personal qualifications you need to have in order to be able to surrender and be detached and cut down that tree and move past it. And then we're talking about this abode, this pada, this place that you're supposed to go to, that's beyond this world. And so then some description of that place is there. And so what you're getting in these later verses is you're getting explanatory notes for the elaborate metaphors that we've already gone over, that then turns those metaphors into a very, very big analogy. Did you guys follow that? So we start off with a metaphor, and then we get these explanatory notes on the back end that turn that metaphor into an analogy so we can really make sense out of what's being intended. Does you guys follow that? Now, those two are easy. Those two are easy. 15:7. All right. Those two are easy. Okay? Now it's going to get a little more intermediate. And what's my question going to be after we read the verse? Huh?
Why would he add something into the verse?
No.
How does it connect?
There you go. How's it connect? You got it? All right, here we go. The living entities in this conditioned world are my eternal fragmental parts. Due to conditioned life, they are struggling very hard with the six senses, which include the mind. You got it? Mam eva angsa. My parts. Jiva loke. In this world of the living. Jiva bhuta. The living beings. The living beings in this world of the living are my eternal fragments. Mana, Shastani, Indriyani. The senses and the sixth sense, which is the mind. The six senses with the mind, so the mind being the sixth sense. Prakriti stani, which are all material. Karshati, they're attracting those senses. So living entities are spiritual, they're my parts, they're in this world, and they are attracting the material energy in the form of their senses, which include the mind. Did you guys follow that? You guys follow that? What's that have to do with the preceding verses? Yeah.
Well, we're talking about two different subjects coming together. So we have to describe, we've already described the eternal abode, and so now we have to describe what's trying to go to the eternal abode, which would be.
Okay. I think you could have skipped we're talking about two subjects coming together. And you could have just said, he described heaven, now he's describing the place that you have to go to heaven from, right? I didn't think of that. I think that's a good explanation. I'm giving you points for that one. It's not what I thought. Anybody else want to jump in? All right. Were you listening on your way over?
Yes.
Okay.
So I think maybe what they're getting at is the fragments, and they're also individuals. It says entities, and they're part of a supreme being. So that's where the individuality comes from earlier when he says supreme being.
Yeah, you're reading that like a Hare Krishna. And so Krishna is not living in a world full of impersonalist, pseudo-spiritualist yogis, where he has to clarify at every moment that we are not in every way one with God, and that our individuality is concrete, and that we are concrete individual sparks of light, and we are not one with the light that we come from. And although there might be a oneness in terms of quality, the goal is not to merge into that oneness and become one in every respect, because that would get rid of love and relationship. Krishna's not at every single moment making that argument. And so, although you, being a devotee, being born a devotee, have drunk in with your mother's breast milk that philosophical idea, and you've heard everybody around you not being able to grasp that obvious idea. And so you feel like every single moment you get a chance to say that, you have to say it. That's not Krishna's, he's not living in that world. Does that make sense? So he's also just saying there's a supreme being, that's where you're going, and you're also, if anything, this is, in a lot of ways, this is like, I guess Jiva Bhuta Sanatana. They are eternally living beings. The word Sanatana means they're eternally beings. This actually supports your point of view, because it actually says Sanatana from Sana, which means old and eternal. And so it's in relationship to the Jiva Bhuta, the living beings. So it actually does support what you're saying. But I think it's more you reading into the verse. I don't think it's bad. It's a great piece of evidence to build that case. But the idea that that's what Krishna's doing, it's like, it seems the threads of connection between those points are rather thin. Did that make sense? You follow that? Okay, good. Can you go ask the Pujari to give me some napkins? Hey, Pujari! Oi, Mahatma Ji! Like 10 napkins. The reason is because if I don't do this for you, you're going to go and get them from the bathroom, which is a massive no-no, and it will give me a full-blown panic attack. So I'm just preemptively. I feel like bathroom things are made to stay in the bathroom. So I don't drink water from the bathroom either. I know it's very common to have a cup on your sink in your bathroom. I don't have a cup on my sink in my bathroom. Actually, I do. It's a lota. I use it as a sort of primitive bidet. But anyway, that's another point. but I definitely never drink from it. And so we also don't get paper towels. Like, you bring like a roll of toilet paper in here, you're like, okay, so, yeah. Anybody else? What do you got?
Krishna is describing the spider web, essentially. He's starting to describe the web that we're trapped in and what that consists of.
Yeah, and that's actually not too different from what you said. You just didn't make any connection with the spider web or the tree. You simply connected it to the preceding verse. When there's a much more powerful connection, if we're looking at the elaborate metaphor that Krishna set up and we're now turning it into an analogy, then for Krishna to be defining the supreme abode you're going to, what the qualifications you are that amount to the asanga, shastrena, chitva, being able to cut it down with the weapon of detachment, what the tat padam parimargatavyam, what that place that you're searching out is, right? And then also now what that tree really amounts to, which was very convoluted. Were you listening on the way down?
Yeah.
It's a very convoluted metaphor. You don't need him. What do you want him for? He's not going to pick up your... No, you're good. That's enough. That's good. We're good. The floor is made to hold water. It's got a butt joint on it, 32nd of an inch. It's a nice clean line. We're good. Did you guys follow this? It's actually almost a perfect... It's super sophisticated. Like, you might not figure it out. Like, I was reading an analogy yesterday to somebody to try and teach him different analogies and similes and metaphors, which is why it's on my mind. And the analogy was talking to my sister. I'm not trying to hate on... I don't have a sister, so it's just theoretical for me. Talking to my sister is like shoveling before a snowstorm. Talking to my sister is like shoveling before a snowstorm. What does that mean? There you go. But not all of you got it. Because shoveling before a snowstorm, you have to actually think it through. What is shoveling? There's nothing. There's no snow. There's nothing to shovel. Therefore, it's a waste of time. And therefore, talking to my sister is also a waste of time. That's an analogy because it explains it. But it's not a free analogy. It's an analogy which requires you to think through what the comparison is, although everything you need is right there. It's actually been explained. It's just been explained in a slightly sophisticated way, which is designed to make you think, and it's kind of fun. It's more fun than a boring analogy where every single thing is spelled out for you. Did you follow that? 2020, this was the other analogy that I read. 2020 is like a train that's come off its tracks and is careening down the landscape and hasn't been able to get back on its tracks. So there's no mistaking there what you're trying to say about the year 2020 and how it's compared to a runaway train. It's cheap. It's easy to follow. It doesn't require any skin in the game and any application of your intelligence. Krishna's analogy now, with all these details, still requires us to think through it. And so we've got this very elaborate and convoluted metaphor about the Ashwatha tree, ergo the banyan tree, with double roots going up and down, leaves and branches going everywhere. It's nourished by the gunas. The Vedas are the leaves. And then I think the twigs are maybe fruit are desires, and then the karma is what binds the roots to the ground, and you can't see where it begins. Nanto nacha adi. You can't see where it begins or where it ends, but you can cut it down. So that it's a very convoluted metaphor with lots of different items within it, and it's open to it's not open to, you can't say anything, and therefore the sky is purple. You can't reach any conclusion from it, but it does allow you to explore it. Sometimes you get verses which allow you to explore them in the way you want to. When you find a verse like that, you should feel free to, within the parameters set by the verse, run and spread your wings and fly. Sometimes you get verses which are much more concrete in what they're describing, and then you should stay chaste to them. If you don't like the verses because they're too defined, then don't read the book. Then just go and write your own book, or journal, and say whatever you want to say, and think whatever you want to think. But when you're looking at a piece of wisdom literature and you want to understand what it says, sometimes you get some room to breathe, and sometimes it's a little more locked down, and you should be able to recognize the difference so that you don't run with a verse where you don't have the room to do it in the name of following the verse, and at the same time where you're not like hunkered down. Like when you gave your explanation, I was like, oh, that's okay. You gave yours, I was like, I don't quite see it. It's something, but it's not quite there. It's a little more conspiratorialist. It's a little more QAnon. Where relation proves causation. And so, you know what I mean? It's like I was sitting at the bus stop and the bus was late. And then the elections were also late. It took them a few extra days to tabulate the votes. You follow? And then when the bus showed up, I didn't have exact change. But then the tabulation on the ballots, according to the news source I'm reading, also didn't they didn't add up to what they were supposed to be either. They found extra votes. And therefore, like, the bus company is run by the same guys who rigged the election. You follow? You find some thin relationship between... Obviously, yours wasn't that bad. But you find some thin relationship between things, and you start running with it. But what you want is you want really solid lines of connection between something. So we've got 3 really solid lines of connection. The living entity is in this world with the senses and the mind. That's the practical enmeshment we find ourselves in. And we get a little bit of a meditational idea of what the nature of heaven is, that everything is self-luminous. Whereas in this world, everything is, innately dark and requires to be illumined by an outside source. Right? Of course, there is one thing that doesn't require to be illumined by an outside source. You know what it is? Life. There's bioluminescence. And so we are alive. And so life, brings its own light to the equation. And so, in the same way, imagine an entire abode that was made up of consciousness. Everything would be light, everything would be alive, everything would be conscious. It's actually a rather deep and profound meditation on the nature of heaven. Heaven is an abode of pure spirit, without the radical dichotomy we find in this world where matter is inert and dead and conscious beings are alive. You're in an abode where everything is alive. It's kind of a far-out meditation on the nature of spirit, on the nature of a spiritual abode, on the nature of a spiritual goal. And then you've also got what it means to cut down that tree with the weapon of detachment. Asanga Shastra, the weapon of detachment. Like satsang means true association or true company, but the word sangha means material association. When you put sat in front of it, it means good association, true spiritual association, and then asanga, to be not attached. And so asanga shastra, the weapon of detachment, with the weapon of detachment. Do you guys follow this? All right, so we've gotten 3 verses that explain the 3 things that we wanted explaining. Interestingly, now you can get into the actual meaning of the verse. So what's the meaning of the verse? The verse is that we are fundamentally spiritual in nature, but we've wound up in this world where we are attracted by dull matter. We've sold ourselves short. We're meant for illumination. We're meant for something higher. But then we're slumming in the material world. Do you follow that? We're slumming in the material world. But we're meant for something higher. And so the verse is quite powerful because it argues, Jiva Bhuta Sanatana, you're eternally a living being. Mam Eva Angsa, you're my part. This is God speaking. But Jiva Loke, you're in this world. Karshati, attracting. That's where you get the word Krishna from. It's the attractive one. Karshati, it's in a verb. You're attracting. What are you attracting? Mana Shastani Indrani. The 6 senses, which includes the mind. 6th sense, they say the same thing in Sanskrit. The 6th sense, the mind. And so the verse is very beautiful, it's very powerful, and it explains why we're meant for that abode and not for this abode, why we should search out that abode. You could ask, why should I cut down a tree? Why should I go to that supreme abode? Because that's who you are, because you're meant for that. Like you could imagine if you met, these examples don't work in the West. They really work well in India, but somehow in the West everybody's dumb, and so they start to try and find fault with it. But it's like the examples I learned as a kid growing up, and they're perfectly fine. There's just something wrong with everybody else. So, when you think everybody's crazy, maybe you're the crazy one. I'm not quite there yet. And so, if you are the child of a very rich person, but you suffer from amnesia, and you're eating out of dumpsters, eating off the street, eating out of garbage cans, and some person comes and sees you, they'll be like, you are the son of the richest person. They're waiting for you at home. You should go home, and there's a wonderful meal and a loving family waiting for you. Why are you degrading yourself out here? The example fails in the West because people think dumpster diving is cool, or they think it's like some kind of, zero waste type, theory, and then they assume it was an abusive environment and that's why they left, and they're spiritual and that's why they left, and they're living in the gutter, and there's all these little kind of other ways to interpret it. Because the same phenomenon is there when you ask somebody, do you want to do something? And they're like, no, yeah, let's do it. You want to go out for lunch? And they're like, no, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's do that. They can't say yeah. They have to say no, yeah. Whereas in any other culture in the world, when you want to say yeah, you know what you say? Or when you want to say yeah, you know what you say in any other culture in the world? You say yeah. And when you want to say no, you know what you say? You say yeah, no. It's actually flipped the other way. You don't want to offend people. So when you don't want to do something, you go, gee, nah. Yeah, no, I don't want to go. Yeah, no. Whereas in our culture, we'll go, no, yeah. Regularly, we do this. So it's just that rebellious nature where we use these analogies. I got to think of something better that won't offend. I don't want to, offend the dumpster divers and the homeless. And, you know what I mean? So anyway, the analogy is perfectly fine. We are meant for something higher. We're selling ourselves short. We're slumming. Of course, that whole slumming idea, it's against people who live in slums. So we're slumming. We're living in a place we're not meant to be living. We're just, we're engaged in trivial pursuits. And we're spending a lot of time thinking about and worrying about and getting preoccupied with things that ultimately don't really matter. But we are conscious beings. We're sparks of the eternal flame. We're like rays of the sun. We're meant for something much higher, much greater, much more wonderful. And so this verse adds something to the discussion because it actually gives you a why you should cut down this tree, why you should search for something higher. It's such a wonderful abode, and you're actually made for that abode. Did you follow it? All right. I wanted to give you a sense there of how the verses actually have some pretty deep meaning. Not that you have to twist out of them. It's there. It's obvious. Like when I just said that, you guys are like, oh yeah, that's what the verse means, right? At least if you were able to follow what I said, you had that thought. And so there's a lot of wisdom packed in these verses. They're connected together in a variety of ways. There's some ways in which you can spread your wings and fly with them, but there's incredible depth and value in just understanding what they say. The living entity in the material world carries his different conceptions of life from one body to another, as the air carries aromas, thus he takes one kind of body and again quits it to take another. So obviously reincarnation is here. The verse says, Shariram yat avapnoti yascha api utkramati ishwaraha. Ishwaraha means the Lord or the controller. But in this verse it's referring to the living entity who controls his body. And he attains a body. Avapnoti shariram. Shariram means that thing which decays. He attains a decaying body. And then utkramati, he also gives up that body, steps beyond that body. Gritva etani samyati. Gritva etani samyati vayurgandam eva ashayat. Eva means like. When you use like or as, what do you know you're dealing with? A simile. Vayu ganda, like the wind and a scent. Ashayat, from its source. Like a wind carries a scent from its source. Similarly, grihitva etani samyati, we carry with us all these desires, all these things we're struggling with, the six senses, including the mind, we carry them with us when we leave this body. We bring them to these bodies and we carry them with us. In other words, you don't get a blank slate every time you take birth. And you don't get a blank slate every time you die. Rather, your attachments and aversions and your materialism and the lessons you have to learn go with you from one life to another, carried just like the wind carries a scent. It's a cool simile, right? And that's why when you die, you don't automatically achieve liberation. And that's why your materialism and your struggle goes from one lifetime to another. Does this make sense? The living entity that's taking on another gross body obtains a certain type of ear, eye, tongue, nose, sense of touch, which are grouped about the mind and thus enjoys a particular set of sense objects. Vishayan upasevate, you enjoy sense objects. Shrocham, shakshu, sparsham, rasanam, granam, adishtaya mana. The living entity has a particular type of ear, eye, sense of touch, tongue, sense of smelling, and they're centered around the mind, and you enjoy sense objects. It happens automatically. You're born in this world, and immediately you're starting to smell stuff and taste stuff and see stuff, and you get attracted to it. Happens automatically. It's natural. That's why you got to cut down that tree with the weapon of detachment, because you naturally become enmeshed in this stuff. Now the spider's web, which was my adaptation of the example of the banyan tree, because the spider's web doesn't freak people out because you just walk through it. What's the big deal? You get a stick and destroy the spider's whole world in 5 seconds flat. But if you walked into a massive spider web of a banyan tree with strong branches, you got in there and you could never get out. You were trapped in there. amidst all these branches that froze you. You could never extricate yourself from that maze. That would be scary. And how does it happen? It happens automatically. Why has God put me in that situation? He didn't, you did. Because you have all these desires. And so you take birth again. And you have to go through it and learn your lessons and get it right. Do you guys follow this? The foolish cannot understand how a living entity can quit his body, nor can they understand what sort of body he enjoys in the spell of the modes of nature. But one whose eyes are trained in knowledge can see all this. In other words, materialistic people are just in the web. They're just in it. And they're dealing with other people who are in it. And it just is like, that's what they're doing. It's a big fiasco. But that person who's jnana chakshush, who sees with the eyes of knowledge. Jnana chakshush means eye, chakshush, jnana of knowledge. One who sees with the eyes of knowledge. That person can see what's going on and have a little detachment and have a little separation and begin to cut down that forest of illusion. Do you guys follow this? A forest, though, it's like a forest has so many different roots. And I think about the banyan tree example. It's all the like difficulty of a forest, but everything all comes from one place. And so there's something beautiful about the banyan tree example, because although it appears like a forest, in actuality, it's all coming from one place. Like usually when you fight the boss, the level boss in a video game, that's what they call it. Like usually there's a guy you fight at the end of each level. They call him a level boss. Usually he has some kind of Achilles heel. And there's some particular movement, which is essentially just moving the joystick in a particular way and pressing the right buttons. And so there's some kind of movement and attack, and then that kills the boss. And then you can graduate to the next level. There's some little Achilles heel in that challenge that you have to figure out. And so if you can figure it out, then you're able to, easily win. Whereas otherwise, it's not so easy. Most likely you die and you can't figure it out. The games are made like that. And so this is a hack where if you can figure out how everything comes from one source, and you understand the basic problem, which is your senses and your mind, and you learn to see the world through the eyes of knowledge and cultivate detachment, that frees you up. Buddha said this. He says suffering is caused by trishna, by thirst, by lust, by desire. Therefore, if you extinguish desire, you extinguish dukkha, or suffering, or sadness. It's also interesting that this would be, sort of like a Buddhist style thought. It seems somewhat pre-theistic. It includes reincarnation, which doesn't really make you a non-materialist. It just means that you're not a gross one-lifetime materialist. But you could still be an atheist and believe that ultimately nihilism exists, but you reincarnate. It kind of sucks. Buddhism sort of sucks because you have all the hard work of believing in God. You have to posit that there's reincarnation, that your desires go with you. It's all the paranormal stuff that a spiritualist has to give evidence for. But then you don't get any of the benefits because there's no God that you get to attach to and no heaven you get to go to. And so you have all the work of the spiritualist because you have to explain all the quasi-religious stuff you believe, but then ultimately at the end of the day you're a materialist, but you just have to work really hard to become nothing when you die, whereas for your average atheist nihilist, you just die and it's over. For the Buddhists, it's like a lot of work to die and have it be over. Do you guys follow that? Yeah. So anyway, the point I was making was a lot of this stuff could be seen as sort of a Buddhist type thought, a pre-theistic type, anti-materialism. But you got to remember that the early verses did establish that there was a deity. And Krishna speaks in the language of, they are my parts. And you search out the Supreme Being and you surrender. So within this, very powerful, and a lot of these universal spirituality, you have some real strong elements of personalism. Do you guys follow that? And not in every verse, but they're there, scattered about enough that you don't never get too far lost. It's like a tetherball game, where the ball might go out there, but it's never that far away from coming back. The endeavoring transcendentalists, who are situated in self-realization, can see all this clearly. But those whose minds are not developed and who are not situated in self-realization, they cannot see what's taking place, although they may try. Yatanta yogina cha enam pashyanti atmani avastitam. The yogis, they strive and they see how everything is situated in the self. Yatanta api akritatmana, but unfinished people. Unfinished. Akrita means undone, unfinished, not finished selves. In other words, people who are not polished spiritually. Yatanta, they're striving, but nainam pashanti achetasa, they can't see all this because they are unconscious. Unconscious, unthinking people can't see all this, even though they strive to, because of their lack of development. But the yogis who strive are able to see all this situated in the self, because they have a spiritual vision which allows them to see how all these external things are going on. All right. Thank you very much for joining us, IGTV. It was a pleasure. See you soon. And then we got some feedback.